So I'm going to actually begin with a reflection on what this movement and this moment means in the form of verse, right? In the form of a poem. Listen, the movement was born as all things are in pain. But what made it possible, what lets it live, is ecstatic, defiant, world-beating, unconditional love. The love of a people for our own breath, our own raised hands, our own spoken names, our own queerness, our own magic. Mine is the only story I can tell. I speak it, sing it, tweet it, me and the rest of we who figured out how to love us and turn up. And so there are a million true tales whipping across the screen in real time, vivid as fiction, but instead a history. This is what it looks like not to despair. We remember what every political animal has ever known. Speech is action that creates. And all these players slaying, giving life, unapologetically declaring their political love as power because survival is not enough. We want to thrive. Let me tell you, there is no post. There is the unmasking, the deconstruction of grins and lies, the deferred dreams of other possible worlds that are not yet, the breach to which we return. Listen, my grandmother was born to sharecroppers on a farm in North Carolina in 1924. At 2 years old, she was run over by a horse and buggy. Somehow, she stood up, unbroken, crying, ready. When she was grown, she moved north so she could work, vote, live. But my mother, a dentist's daughter, spent her youth wiping the spittle of white children from her face and learning not to let the word nigger knock her down. Later, I was told Black girls are never beautiful unless they look like white girls. Good thing I was smart, like Oprah, smart enough to walk the halls of one ivory tower after another, not minding, not too much, not enough to fall. The loud whispers wondering how such a Black girl could take up so much white space. And of course, along the way, there have been too many losses, unspeakable losses, in money and blood. Yet, to mention reparation is not polite. We are supposed to get up, pants pulled up, hoodies shed, respectable, unbroken, crying, ready. They call us to forgive, but the movement reminds us that the choice in answering is ours. That's how I know that the movement loves us, is us, getting free. Listen, this hearing will be no easier than any other trial. The outcome, as uncertain. All I can report is what movements have long showed. Together, we are a reckoning. Okay, so I want to start this talk by talking about what freedom is and what freedom means when we don't get to start from ideal circumstances, when there is no time one before domination and oppression, before white supremacy, before patriarchy, before capitalism. We have to start where we are now. So in starting where we are now, we have to think about freedom in a way that is not so usual in political philosophy, okay? So let me start talking a little bit about how the movement seems to conceive of freedom. The movement's political philosophy and its commitments come from inductive observation, the inductive observation of the problem of injustice. They build their theory of justice by examining the structural, institutional, and political forces and practices that allow Black lives to be systematically targeted for demise, as Alicia Garza puts it. This basis in experience makes the political philosophy of the movement divergent from the abstract humanisms that have characterized modernity. Instead of asking what constitutes justice, The movement asks, what does it mean to experience justice? This inductive and pragmatic question, what does it mean to experience justice, also yields a distinctive notion of freedom that's close to the concept that my colleague and friend Neil Roberts articulates as freedom as marronage, which is also the name of the book where he details this concept. Conceptualizing freedom as marronage means rejecting freedom as a binary. Either one is free or is not free, right? Because marronage is a French word that means in flight, right? So freedom is a process, or as Angela Davis might put it, freedom is a constant struggle, okay? So this conceptualization of freedom as not a binary, either you're free or not free, holds that a linear developmental view of progress toward a definitive freedom will always yield a distorted picture that cannot account for the empirical conditions of oppression and domination that exist in the world as it is. Instead, freedom in this sense, in the sense of marronage, affirms that we are always in the process of flight toward freedom as liberation, which is the ongoing undoing of common understandings, systems, and practices that reproduce oppressive conditions. Put differently, the political philosophy of the movement points to the wisdom that the task of those who care about justice is always and ever will be a continued striving to get free. Okay? All right. So the question then becomes, what does this have to do with care? And I want to do this by sort of way of a story. Okay? So the Movement for Black Lives wants to create a world in which all Black people can live and thrive, right? In which all people can be free. In a reflection on the movement at 4 years old that Chanel Matthews and Miski Noor, both organizers in the Movement for Black Lives, wrote in 2018, they said of the movement, quote, "We are expansive. We are a collective of liberators who believe in an inclusive and spacious movement. We also believe that in order to win and bring as many people with us along the way, we must move beyond the narrow nationalism that is all too prevalent in some Black communities. We must ensure we are building a movement that brings all of us to the front. We affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. We are working for a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise. We affirm our humanity, our contributions to the society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. The call for Black lives to matter is a rallying cry for all Black lives striving for liberation. Liberation then calls for strategies of political, social, and interpersonal practice that take aim at identifying and mitigating the complicated structural and institutional causes and effects of domination and oppression. This is not an easy task. And in fact, identifying and undoing these structures can only ever be an iterative process, one which just societies have to develop a habit of revisiting and returning to. Okay? A little bit on domination and oppression, because these are words that we often throw around without defining them clearly. I choose to go to the definitions of domination and oppression of Iris Marion Young. And so Young writes that domination is, quote, the structural or systematic phenomena that excludes people from participating in determining their actions or conditions of their actions in their lives, okay? Domination has to be understood as structural rather than as the imposition of the directed will of a malevolent individual, right? Like domination is not about an evil bad guy or a boogeyman. It has to be understood as structural, okay? Because the constraints that people experience on their daily lives are usually the unintended product of the actions of many people operating according to the laws and habits of institutions which predated their existence and are outside their intentionality. Individuals have choices, but those choices are constrained by the world as it currently exists, by the laws, customs, and common ways of understanding that characterize the way people live their lives in a particular time and place. These constraints can and do produce outcomes that are both patterned, that is, they have a pattern, and systematic, and unintended by the individual, or sometimes unintended by the individuals that are both acting independently and are always already imbricated in the rules and mores that exist and are beyond their control. Okay? As an illustration of what domination is, let's take this story that was told to me by a police officer who I interviewed for my book, my forthcoming book, which is called Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. Okay. For me, this story really underlined and had a hugely persuasive effect in making me understand what the call for abolition of police and prisons that comes from the movement means. Like many of you, I was very skeptical of this kind of claim and sort of unsure what it could mean or why it would be necessary. And actually, this story that was told to me by a police officer made me understand why such a claim could be necessary, okay? All right, and I'm quoting from this officer. I have exercised authority as an officer that I considered abusive and created some serious moral dilemmas for me at times. As a relevant example, I was recently called to an apartment because a maintenance worker went inside and found 3 children left alone, ages 2, 5, and 8. We tracked down Mom, who was working a shift at Walmart. Mom was cooperative and honest, and it appeared that she typically left her children alone during her 6 to 8 hour shifts at night, and she worked about 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. or 4 p.m. to midnight. My sergeant and I did not want to arrest her. She was violating the law by leaving an 8-year-old to care for her 5 and 2-year-old siblings, and that was not safe. But she was in a really tough spot. My sergeant and I came to the conclusion that not taking charges, that is, not charging her, would create a liability for us, that is, a situation in which the police department could be sued or otherwise blamed, should she continue to leave her children alone at night to work, and if they were harmed in the future while she was away. I made sure to pursue the least severe charge in both severity and number of counts, but my ability to address the situation was limited by my professional function. My ability to address the situation was limited by my professional function. I also involved CPS, of course, that is Child Protective Services, with the aim of getting some sort of social service in place for the mom, but I have limited influence over how a social worker handles their case, okay? This police officer knows the circumstances which have caused this mother to break the law are well beyond her own control and intentionality, and are indeed because we live in a society in which there is no such thing as a living wage and affordable childcare. And further, that by enforcing the law, right, this police officer knows, in this case, he will cause more harm and damage than the situation that is ostensibly being addressed. The time and expense of adjudicating the charges that were put against this mother who had to work, right, will have a measurably negative and potentially devastating impact on the lives of this mother and children. This mother will likely lose her job because she's being charged with a crime. And if she is convicted of a felony, she will have trouble finding employment in the future. She is also in danger of losing custody of her children. The children are in danger of being separated from both their mother and one another. Or if they are able to remain with their mother, who will now be more financially strapped and less employable, they are in danger of sinking into a poverty that grabs hold of generations. The institutional conditions which precipitate this dominative situation, in which both the relatively more powerful and the relatively less powerful have their intentions and choices constrained in a way that makes outcomes worse for everyone, okay, is a symptom of oppressive conditions. Oppression, writes Young, is the disadvantage and injustice some people suffer because the everyday practices of a well-intentioned liberal society. It consists of the systemic constraints on groups that are not necessarily the result of bad intentions or the intentions of a tyrant, but are instead embedded in the unquestioned norms, habits, symbols, laws, and assumptions underlying institutional rules and the collective consequences of following those rules. Okay? With its call for abolition and its call for care and its notion of liberation, right, of freedom as Marronage, the movement for Black lives seeks to take aim at domination and oppression by actively trying to imagine and enact a world in which Black people and all people might be free. Indeed, it is hard to overstate the place of freedom in the conception of movement activists, organizers and activists. When asked about the ultimate goal of the movement to a person, all the people that I interviewed, each activist described a world in which people could be free of this kind of domination and oppression. Chanel Matthews, who's the formal communications director of Black Lives Matter Global Network, put it this way, quote, "The work is about changing people's behavior so that Black people can live free, full lives in this democracy. And we don't have to be afraid. We can parent our children into adulthood and have access to the rights, the resources, and the recognition that we all need to live our best lives." And what is the only way that this can happen? It's through a politics that is reoriented toward care, okay? Now, care here is not a mere sentiment, nor does it indicate a posture of deference or coddling. Instead, care hews closely to the dictionary definition. In its noun form, it means the provision of what is necessary for the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection, and serious attention to doing something correctly in order to avoid unnecessary damage or risk. As a verb, care means to undertake with care, to feel concern or interest for something, to attach importance to it, and provide for the needs one observes. In this way, the politics of care begins with the conviction that it matters. Listen, it begins with the conviction that it matters when whole populations are hurting from harms inflicted by the way we have structured society so that some people are systematically advantaged and others are systematically disadvantaged. Okay? It matters. Just like Black Lives Matter, it matters that we have designed politics so that some voices are much more likely to be heard and have influence than others. Though all may formally bear equal claim to citizenship. It matters that in the United States, we have a grotesquely huge carceral system that consigns some people to not only be confined in cages, but also to what Orlando Patterson has called social death, or the denial of full personhood and the market disposability. And so to care means to take not only the material deprivation, but the pain that accompanies these political realities seriously, and to work to mitigate the causes and repair the devastating results. A politics of care begins with the notion that it matters if we're hurting, that we must attend to that in the conception and carrying out of our activities toward governance, and in any viable conception of what it means to get free. Okay, so I think that now we're going to open things up for questions, and my colleague Christina is going to help me do this. So take it away.
Hi everyone. So some of you have started submitting questions. You can submit through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or you could also click the raise hand button also located at the bottom of your screen, to be able to come on camera to ask your question to Natalie. So I'll call on you once you raise your hand, and we'll invite you to join as a panelist to be able to be on camera. And you also have the option to ask questions anonymously, and I'll read those out to Professor Woodly. So right now we have a question from Lori. Lori, would you mind raising your hand to ask on camera? We'll give Lori a few moments.
Oh, Lori doesn't want to be on camera.
Okay. Oh, I see that. All right, I'll read her question. Is there a clear, agreed upon vision for a non-abusive collection of societal practices? If so, how has that been derived? If not, do you think there is something that is needed? If so, why? If not, why not?
If you mean, is there some kind of doctrine of care? No, there is not. Remember, the movement for Black Lives, or the political philosophy of the movement for Black Lives, is inductive. So that means that it comes from lived experiences. And it also means that there is no one-size-fits-all strategy for care, right? Instead, what's important is to have the principle of care at the center of our conceptions of governance, okay? And different people in different places will require different kinds of care, right? Different things that support the maintenance of their lives and their ability to live and thrive. So I don't think that there needs to be any one doctrine. I think that's antithetical to the perspective of the movement itself, right? Which is really based in lived experience. So since we have diverse experiences, right? Black people have diverse experiences, non-Black people of color have diverse experiences, and all people in the world do. So we have to derive best practices that are place specific and community specific and need specific, not based on some preordained doctrine, right? This is inductive, that is bottom up theorizing and political practice, not deductive, that is top down theorizing and political practice.
We have a question from Julie. Her audio is not working, so I'll read her question. Please provide recommendations to create a community of care. What would that look like, and how do we get there?
I don't know what you mean by provide recommendations to create a community of care. Again, it depends on your community, right? I think that the first things that we need to think about are people's basic needs being met, right? That's always the first kind of question. And then the second question is, or rather a simultaneous question with basic needs is, do people have a voice in determining how their lives are going to go, right? So in addition to basic needs, people need also to avoid a dominative situation, even one that is supposed to be caring, right? People have to have a voice in how their lives are going to be able to be arranged, and in what their community needs, in how we are able to provide for the needs of everyone in our community.
Great. We have a question from Rita. Rita, would you like to ask your question on camera? If so, please raise your hand. Okay, no. So Rita's question is this been seen as related to compassionate systems framework promoted by Peter Singh?
No, it's not, right? Like, because again, this is not a paternalistic version of care, right? This is not a top-down thing, right? This is about people being able to govern themselves with the view that care has to be at the center of what's going on, right? So this is why the sort of juxtaposition between punishment and care is so important. Because right now we have a system that makes a lot of rules about how it's appropriate to act, and then has a lot of structures which makes it impossible for a lot of people to comport with those rules, right? That is a backwards system, and it causes punishment to be the recourse for a lack of rule following. Politics of care, on the other hand, asks us to start from a completely different place and to ask, do people have what they need in order to fulfill their capabilities according to themselves, right? not according to some sort of, compassionate set of decision makers on high, right? This is about community care and community self-governance. And that means starting with people having conversations with each other about how they want to arrange their lives, and then having the resources to enact the changes that they decide on.
Thank you. The next question we have from Claire Potter. Claire, can you please raise your hand so we can include you in this conversation? Thank you. We're going to promote you as panelists now.
Hi, Claire.
Thank you so much for that talk. I love hearing you talk about your research. I guess part of what I was thinking about is the specifics about the politics of care, how you enact them, which is taking the interests of the most marginal people and putting them at the center of
Right.
what you do, and how that alters not just your perspective, but actually gives everyone a job to do. And one of the things I like about that is it's so concrete, that the act of changing your perspective then also can guide you in listening and acting and so on. Part of what I'm thinking about is what it would mean to take the smaller units of our society, workplaces, or in our case, a university, and reorganize it that way, because actually universities work in the exact opposite ways. The interests of the most powerful people are most prominently at the center of everything we do. So can you just sort of play with that a little bit? What would it mean to reorganize a university around a politics of care?
It would mean in decision-making, in major decision-making, we would center the voices of the people who are the most impacted by changes. So in our case, that would mean contingent and part-time faculty would start discussions about how our resources were going to be distributed, right, in this moment and in other moments. And then other people would join in right after those who were the most marginalized were able to set the agenda, as it were. It's pretty straightforward, right? Like, it means that, it's the same reason that the movement, in order to include all Black lives, they have to center voices of trans folks, incarcerated folks, folks who are sex workers, poor folks, because otherwise you kind of never get to those questions. And if you never get to those questions, or you don't let those folks set the agenda, then you never develop solutions that address their problems. And you end up in a situation where you're perpetuating what Kathy Cohen has called secondary marginalization, right? So in trying to do the right thing, you still perpetuate injustice because you started in the wrong place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. What recommendations do you have for encouraging individuals to push for their community of care and ensure their basic needs are being met? A lot of times people ask, where do I start?
Yes, well, I think that the first thing to think about is getting involved in civic organizations where you are, right? Or movement organizations where you are, or both. You can't have a community of care unless you have an environment where people actually speak to each other, right? Talk to each other. We actually live in places a lot of times where people are don't have the civic habit of getting together and making decisions about their communities, and don't know how to set agendas for their communities. So the first part is really trying to get together with other people and talk. Now, organizers do this, that this is a sort of process of organizing, but people can sort of organize themselves, right, in just community groups. This is why plain civic groups are just, or social groups, are so important, because, and when I say important, I mean important politically, because I'm a political scientist, because even when those groups are not doing directly political work, that is where you start the democratic process, right? And I don't mean electoral democratic process, I mean the process of governing yourself. The processes of governing ourselves have to start with our relation to each other our conversations with each other, our ability to coordinate actions with each other. And you actually need a lot of practice for that. You need practice in the form of, creating, book groups and, little libraries and civic groups for, thinking about your school board and your city council. All of these things are really important to being able to even coordinate, communities of care. And these are group functions, they're not individual functions. It's not about being personally caring or kind. It's about how can you get together with other people, right? And learn how to talk together and think together and coordinate your activities together. And that's something that then can scale up, right? Once you have the habit of it on a small scale, you can scale that up. And there are lots of examples of this in this moment. Mutual aid groups and societies have become very, very sort of more revived in the COVID moment because the state, different states have been different in this, but the federal government has mostly left people on their own. This is also happening in movement spaces and movement organizations, is that we have to sort of learn how to coordinate our activities so that we can help each other. This, by the way, doesn't mean the state is off the hook. It doesn't mean that the state ought not be providing for its constituents. It ought to, right? The state doesn't drop out of this picture. It's just that real movement toward communities of care has to start with communities and can't actually kind of be jump-started by the state, right? Communities have to get together and talk and then make their demands at the state.
Thank you. We have another anonymous question. Can communities of care exist in white dominant workspaces that traditionally rely on hierarchy, or does the politics of care mandate new structures in the workplace?
I think that it definitely mandates new structures in the workplace. On the question of hierarchy, that's something that people have to sort of decide on their own. I am not personally against hierarchy of all kinds, but I think that it has to be determined in the space. White-dominated workspaces, if they want to sort of attend toward the politics of care, have to do what we've been talking about, and that is center the most marginalized, right? So that means that, and if you're in a workspace that has no people who are not white upper class people, then that's where you begin, right? Like you need to diversify those spaces. But it's relatively straightforward. Like I said, there's no one size fits all. This is a kind of conversation that has to start with this principle of centering the most marginalized and then building structures from the agendas that are set from those conversations.
Thank you for that question. We now have Fiona Diffenbacher who has a question, who will come on camera. Fiona has raised her hand, so we'll bring her in as a panelist so she can appear on screen. It seems that there is not a video option for Fiona, so we're promoting her to co-host, so hopefully that will change. Give us a moment. Thank you.
Is she there?
There we go.
Okay,
Hi,
there
Fiona.
she is.
We'll just unmute you.
Connection is a little slow. Apologies. Thank you so much, Deva, for the conversation. I just wanted to follow up on Claire's comment earlier about how we can really reimagine that in an institutional model here at the New School. But particularly to follow up, what really resonated for me was the statement within the story, my ability to address the situation was limited by professional function that the police officer identified. And I think that also has correlation to those of us that hold positions of power and authority within the institutional model. And so particularly with that in mind, there's often that same conflict, if you will, sort of a personal desire to create that community of care, because that comes from your own particular point of view. But there is this sort of dissonance between you personally and the sort of role and the functions of that role that you inhabit. Mm-hmm. And so I was sort of wanting, maybe you could talk a little bit about how we could reimagine that and use our authority, use our power, give that away, and what that looked like. I mean, I loved your comment around sort of reorienting, bringing those most marginalized, most impacted to the center. So that begs a responsibility to those of us that have the opportunity to do that. So how would we partner with that? Because we obviously have responsibility in a particular role. Should we just bring the marginalized into those conversations from the beginning and remain present but listening versus leading in those moments? Or how would that play out in sort of tangible ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think listening is really important, but it's also, okay, so several things to say. So the idea of bringing people in order to sort of, I don't know, bringing people in has an element of sort of like permission that is not exactly what I mean. Okay, so it's not really about importing people for the purpose of educating those who have relatively more power. Instead, it's about how you structure your conversations, right? And sort of like building it into the structure of what you do. So it's really not about like sort of like bringing people in to sort of like spotlight like their story or something. Instead, it's like you just have a meeting, right? You call a meeting, you have like the kind of normal things that you would do, but you prioritize, you begin, right? With people who are the most impacted by the institutional or policies or structures that are in play. So in this way, it's a very pragmatic kind of set of recommendations, right? In addition to this sort of, I don't want to let this be isolated to the institution, right? The institution is imbricated in larger structures as well, right? So at the same time that sort of in my story of the police, or if we're talking about the university, they're also in a larger sort of set of social and economic structures that constrain them in different ways. But the purpose is to name those things, right? The purpose is to name and understand those things and then make changes accordingly. And not everything can be handled at the institutional level. Some things really do have to be handled at the structural level, right? Like, so, so in the case of, for example, the university or any kind of like institutional corporation, it's also the case that we're all living in the sort of economic and structural constraints of New York City, right? Or surrounding area of, an environment in which there's no such thing as affordable childcare or for any childcare at all right now, right? In this COVID moment, where a lot of people have other kinds of contingencies, where we have a racial wealth gap, which means that people have really different access to fallback resources, where some people have a second country house and some people do not. You know what I mean? Like, so it's not as though this can all be isolated to the institution. We have to take action where we are by restructuring how we make decisions, with the awareness of and the intention to confront the structural constraints that affect us all. And indeed, those structural constraints are the things that can often make it more possible to change things institutionally. Do you know what I mean? Our understanding of those structural constraints help us to make the institutional changes because it makes us understand how we are relatively positioned in society and what things about society have to change in order for the most marginalized and all of us to be able to live and thrive.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
We have one last question from Jacqueline. Jacqueline, could you please turn on your video to ask your question?
And probably good. Hi, thank you so much, Professor Woodley. I really appreciate it. I also got to listen to you discuss politics of care yesterday, and it was really informative, so I appreciate it. And I wanted to ask about, in a particularly in the New York context, because I lived here for a few years. I grew up in the South, but I live in New York now. Like the situation with Jumaane Williams during the protests recently, right? So his position is one, like as public advocate, is one that is supposed to be translating the concerns of those who are not getting care, who are marginalized, who are not getting the access they should, at least by like governing standards, supposedly. His position is one to communicate further, and I would be interested to hear about if there are other examples of like the communication pattern, so that like, because there was a whole argument about when people were jailed after protests, for instance, he went to go see the people and what the conditions they were in, and the government just didn't let him, even though that's literally his role in the space of government, is to be an advocate for those who are otherwise not advocated for. And I would just be interested to hear about how the communication works from the hierarchical perspective, like from a hierarchical perspective, how we step in and actually have the communication from the grassroots up, when you're dealing with a hierarchy.
Well, I mean, so in a situation like that, you're in a situation where you have to demand different relations, right? Like, so, you know, it is indeed an institutional failure that a public advocate is not able to do their job of public advocacy, but that's why we have protests, right? Like, I mean, that's why we have in a situation like that, the issue is not that we don't have the right institutional pathways. The issue is that those who hold a monopoly of force are not ceding the authority to the governed, who are actually the root of their authority, right? And so that's why we have protests of direct action, because in a situation like that, you have to take power away from those decision makers. It's not really a question of communication through the hierarchy, right? It's a question of public communication. It's a question of public demand and protest. It's a question of stripping power from officials who are abusing it, right? And not only as individuals, but actually changing those institutions and eliminating those seats of power.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We have a few more questions, but we're slowly running out of time, so we'll take one more. This question's from Amaya. Amaya, will promote you to appear on screen to ask your question.
Hi. I can't hear you. Okay, there you go.
Hi, yeah, am I clear?
Yes, hi. Hello.
Hi. So my question is kind of sort of like throughout my daily life when I'm encountering people who don't understand like why creating communities of care is important, and people in general who just don't get it, like they don't understand why there's a need for things like this. I wanted to know, like, what are your suggestions to explain it to them, particularly to people who are kind of like really close-minded about it and not really, like open to hearing new perspectives? Like, how would you suggest that I best approach those types of people in those situations?
Well, I think it depends on what your relationship with those people is, right? You know, this is the thing about a politics of care, right? It's not really a doctrine, right? It's a principle for relationship, which means that we approach different people differently depending on what our relation is with them. But also in terms of people being closed-minded to new ideas and such, like, there are people who are hostile, right, to Black people, people who don't believe in white supremacy, people who are hostile, you know, in a variety of ways. But there are also people who are just overwhelmed. Most of us are overwhelmed most of the time because of the political economy that we exist in, right? Like most of us are trying to find, especially in New York, right? You know, like most of us are trying to figure out where the next dollar is going to come from so that it can go out the door, right? To the next person. And so, you know, that kind of level of stress and worry about our survival, even when we're not poor, right? Especially when we're poor, but even when we're not poor, makes it hard to take time to think about transforming society, right? Like, so that's a big ask. So I would say that instead of thinking about this in terms of doctrine, we think about this in terms of creating relationships and also creating the conditions in our communities and in our society where we can take time to talk and think and imagine, right? Radically imagine what else, you know, how to sort of implement that other world, right? Which is possible. So I would say don't start with a kind of like blame and frustration with people. Instead, you know, in as much as you can, right? Like obviously people can be frustrated, but you know, instead think about how is it that we can be in relation so that we can continue this conversation, right? Like there are no quick fixes. If you're talking about societal transformation, which is what the movement is talking about, right? Real transformation, and indeed an inversion of the way that we normally do things, bottom up instead of top down, that's something that's a generational task, right? That's what I mean by iterative. You go back again, you go back again, and you go back again. So it's about, you know, as Mary Hooks of Southerners on New Ground says, being transformed in the service of the work, right? And transforming our relationships so that we can have a society that is more conducive to life, basically. So that's what I say. It's a complicated answer, but the first thing is try to be in relation with people and not be so frustrated with them as much as you can. And then build from there, right? Like you got to build from that piece, right, of just relationship, and then conversation, and then advocating for changes locally and in the political economy, which keeps us so overwhelmed all the time.
Mm. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Amaya.
you.
All right, so that's all the time we have now. We will share the remaining questions with you, Professor Woodly, that after the event, so you can review. So
Okay. Thank you so much to everyone. I really appreciate having you here and the ability to share these ideas. And I hope that we are all able to participate in this moment together. I think that right now, people in the streets, people who are writing and talking and thinking about all of these issues, we are the folks who are going to set the conditions, the terms on which the 21st century is lived. And I hope that we will set terms in which Black people can live and thrive, and all people can live and thrive. Thank you.